Hey everyone, today we dive into one of the most haunting chapters in medical history. The story of how humanity has struggled to understand and treat the human mind. This isn't just a story about medicine, it's a story about hope, desperation, and the dangerous line between healing and harm. What we're about to explore together will take us from ancient dungeons to modern operating rooms, from medieval superstitions to Nobel Prize-winning discoveries, and ultimately to one of the most controversial medical procedures ever performed. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now get comfortable, grab something to drink, and let's experience this incredible story together. Picture this, it's 1935, and a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Muniz is sitting in his Lisbon office, staring at brain scans and patient files scattered across his desk. The autumn rain patters against his window as he contemplates the screams echoing through the corridors of mental institutions across Europe. These places where thousands of people are locked away, forgotten by society, their minds trapped in prisons of their own making. Muniz has spent decades studying the human brain, and he believes he's on the verge of a breakthrough that could free these tortured souls. He has no idea that his discovery will become one of the most controversial medical procedures in history, a practice that would both save lives and destroy them in equal measure, forever changing how we think about the mind, the brain, and what it means to be human. But to understand how we got to this pivotal moment, we need to travel back much further, to a time when mental illness was wrapped in mystery, fear, and superstition. For thousands of years, people suffering from what we now recognize as depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other mental conditions were considered cursed by the gods, punished for moral failings, or simply evidence of evil spirits inhabiting the human body. The ancient Greeks had some understanding that mental illness might have physical causes, but this knowledge was largely lost during the Dark Ages. In medieval Europe, the mentally ill faced a terrible fate. Some were burned as witches, their unusual behavior interpreted as evidence of demonic possession. Others were chained in dungeons beneath castles and monasteries, forgotten by everyone except the guards who threw them scraps of food. The lucky ones might find themselves in early hospitals run by religious orders, but even these were hardly places of healing. They were more like human warehouses where society could hide its most vulnerable members, keeping them out of sight and out of mind. The fortunate few who had wealthy families might be kept at home, locked in attics or cellars, their existence a shameful secret. Families would tell neighbors that their afflicted relatives had died or moved away, anything to avoid the stigma of mental illness. The isolation was complete and crushing. There was no understanding, no hope, no treatment, just endless suffering in the darkness. This began to change slowly in the 17th and 18th centuries as the Age of Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking about human nature and suffering. Philosophers like John Locke began to argue that the mind was not fixed at birth but could be shaped by experience and education. If the mind could be educated, perhaps it could also be healed. This revolutionary idea would eventually transform how society viewed mental illness, but the change would be painfully slow. The first real breakthrough came in 1793, when a French physician named Philippe Pinel was appointed to oversee the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris. Walking through the facility for the first time, Pinel was horrified by what he saw. Patients were chained to walls in dark, filthy cells, many of them naked, living in their own waste. They were treated worse than animals, beaten by guards, and left to die in their own madness. The screams and moans that echoed through the corridors were deafening, a symphony of human suffering that had been ignored for centuries. In a moment that would echo through medical history, Pinel made a decision that shocked his colleagues and the public. He ordered the chains removed, not from one or two patients, but from all of them. "These people are sick," he declared to the astonished staff, "not criminals. They deserve our care, not our punishment." It was the first time in centuries that someone in authority had suggested that mental illness might be a medical condition, rather than a moral failing or supernatural curse. The results were immediate and dramatic. Patients who had been written off as hopeless began to respond to kindness and respect. Jean-Baptiste Poussin, a former patient himself who had recovered and become a supervisor at the hospital, worked alongside Pinel to develop what they called moral treatment. This revolutionary approach treated mentally ill patients with dignity, providing them with clean clothes, decent food, and meaningful activities. For the first time in memory, People with mental illness were seen as human beings deserving of care rather than punishment. The transformation was remarkable. Patients who had been violent and unmanageable became calm and cooperative when treated with respect. Those who had been mute for years began to speak. People who had been considered permanently insane started to recover and return to their families. The success rate was extraordinary, with many hospitals reporting recovery rates of 80 to 90% for patients who received moral treatment. Word of these miraculous recoveries spread across Europe and to America. Reformers like Dorothea Dix in the United States began campaigning for better treatment of the mentally ill, using Pinel's work as evidence that recovery was possible. New hospitals were built based on moral treatment principles, with spacious grounds, recreational facilities, and programs designed to engage patients' minds and bodies. These institutions looked more like resorts than hospitals, with gardens, libraries, workshops, and social activities. The retreat at York in England, founded by William Tuke in 1796, became a model for humane treatment. Patients lived in comfortable rooms, ate nutritious meals, and participated in meaningful work and recreation. The atmosphere was more like a boarding house than a hospital, with patients and staff eating together and engaging in conversation. Violence was rare, and restraints were almost never used. Visitors came from around the world to study this revolutionary approach to mental health care. In America, hospitals like the Hartford Retreat in Connecticut and the McLean Hospital in Massachusetts adopted similar approaches. These institutions attracted wealthy patients and prominent physicians, raising the profile of moral treatment and mental health care in general. For the first time, having a mental illness didn't automatically mean a life sentence of misery and isolation. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn. And as the 19th century progressed, the very success of moral treatment began to work against it. The dramatic recoveries and humane conditions attracted more and more patients. Families who had previously kept their mentally ill relatives hidden at home began bringing them to these new hospitals. State governments, seeing the potential for emptying overcrowded poorhouses and jails, began referring more patients to mental institutions. The carefully balanced patient-to-staff ratios that had made moral treatment so effective became impossible to maintain. Hospitals designed for 50 patients were housing 200 or more. The individual attention that had been the key to recovery became a luxury that cash-strapped institutions couldn't afford. The recreational programs and meaningful work that had engaged patients' minds were replaced by custodial care focused solely on maintaining order and preventing escapes. By the 1870s, many of these hospitals had become warehouses again, though cleaner and more humane than their predecessors. The moral treatment era was ending, not because it had failed, but because society wasn't willing to pay for the staffing and resources it required. The lesson was clear but largely ignored. Effective mental health treatment required significant investment in time, money, and human resources. As the 19th century drew to a close, massive state hospitals housed tens of thousands of patients, many of whom had been there for decades. These institutions had become small cities unto themselves, with their own farms, workshops, and even cemeteries. Families would bring their loved ones to these places and never see them again. The staff, overwhelmed and undertrained, could do little more than maintain basic order and prevent violence. Patients spent their days in crowded wards, often with nothing to do but wait for meals and sleep. The lucky ones might work in the hospital laundry or kitchen, but most simply sat in long rows of chairs, staring at walls or out windows, their minds slowly deteriorating in the endless monotony of institutional life. The human cost was staggering, with thousands of people essentially buried alive in these facilities. It was into this world of desperation and hopelessness that a new generation of doctors emerged in the early 20th century, determined to find medical solutions to mental suffering. These physicians had witnessed the failures of moral treatment and were convinced that mental illness must have physical causes that could be treated with physical interventions. They were inspired by the remarkable advances in other areas of medicine, from the discovery of germs to the development of anesthesia and surgical techniques. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1917, an Austrian doctor named Julius Wagner Jauregg was working with patients suffering from general paresis, a severe mental condition caused by advanced syphilis. These patients experienced progressive dementia, paralysis, and eventual death. Wagner Jauregg noticed something remarkable. Patients who contracted malaria sometimes showed dramatic improvements in their mental symptoms. The high fever from malaria seemed to slow or even stop the progression of the syphilis that was destroying their brains. This observation led Wagner Jauregg to begin deliberately infecting his patients with malaria, carefully monitoring their fevers and treating the malaria with quinine once it had done its work. It sounds barbaric today, but it was actually quite effective. Many patients who had been deteriorating rapidly stabilized or even improved. Some were able to return to their families and resume normal lives. Wagner Jauregg's work was so groundbreaking that he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927, becoming the first psychiatrist to receive this honor. The success of malaria therapy inspired other doctors to look for physical treatments for mental illness. If controlled fever could cure one form of mental illness, what other physical interventions might work? The search began in earnest for ways to physically alter the brain or body to treat psychiatric conditions. Some doctors experimented with insulin shock therapy, developed by Polish neurologist Manfred Sekel in 1927. Sekel discovered that putting patients into diabetic comas with large doses of insulin could sometimes improve symptoms of schizophrenia and other mental conditions. The treatment was dangerous, with patients hovering between life and death during the coma, but some showed remarkable improvements when they awakened. Others tried inducing seizures with various chemicals, believing that the electrical chaos in the brain during a seizure might somehow reset abnormal thought patterns. Italian physicians Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini developed electroconvulsive therapy in 1938 using electrical current to induce controlled seizures. This treatment proved effective for severe depression and is still used today, though with much better safety protocols. These treatments were desperate measures for desperate times, but they reflected a growing understanding that mental illness was indeed a medical condition with physical causes. The problem was that medical science in the early 20th century lacked the sophisticated understanding of brain chemistry and neurology that we have today. Doctors were essentially flying blind, using trial and error to find treatments that might work. The psychiatric hospitals of the 1930s were laboratories of experimentation, with doctors trying everything from cold water baths to rotating machines designed to shake patients into sanity. Most of these treatments were ineffective or even harmful, but they demonstrated the medical profession's growing commitment to finding physical solutions to mental illness. It was against this backdrop of medical experimentation and desperation that Antonio Egas Moniz made his fateful discovery. In 1935, at the Second International Congress of Neurology in London, Moniz attended a presentation by American researchers Carlisle Jacobson and John Fulton. They had been experimenting on chimpanzees, studying the effects of removing different parts of the brain on behavior and learning. The researchers described two chimpanzees, Becky and Lucy, who had been trained to perform complex tasks for food rewards. Before surgery, when the chimps made mistakes, they would become frustrated and aggressive, screaming and throwing themselves against their cages. But after having parts of their frontal lobes removed, their behavior changed dramatically. They still made mistakes, but they no longer became upset about them. They remained calm and docile, seemingly free from the anxiety and frustration that had previously tormented them. Most doctors at the conference were horrified by the implications. The idea of deliberately damaging a human brain seemed to violate everything medicine stood for. The frontal lobe was known to be involved in personality, emotion, and higher thinking. Removing it seemed like destroying the very essence of what made someone human. But Moniz saw something different. He saw thousands of patients locked away in institutions, their minds trapped in cycles of anxiety, depression, and psychosis. He saw families torn apart by mental illness, and he saw a medical profession that had few effective treatments to offer. If removing part of the brain could calm these tortured minds, wasn't it worth trying? The chimps, after all, seemed happier after their operations, even if they were less intelligent. Moniz returned to Portugal with a radical idea. Working with a neurosurgeon named Almeida Lima, he began planning the first human experiments in what he called leucotomy, later known as lobotomy. The procedure would involve drilling holes in the skull and cutting connections between the frontal lobe and other parts of the brain. The goal was to disconnect the emotional centers of the brain from the thinking centers, hopefully eliminating the overwhelming anxiety and depression that plagued so many patients. The first patient was a 63-year-old woman suffering from severe anxiety and depression. She had been hospitalized for months, unable to function, tormented by constant worry and despair. The operation was performed on November 12, 1935, with Moniz directing and Lima operating. Using a leukotomy, a specially designed instrument, Lima made small cuts in the white matter connecting the frontal lobe to the rest of the brain. The results seemed promising. The woman's anxiety disappeared almost immediately. She became calm and manageable, no longer tormented by the fears that had dominated her life. She was able to have conversations, participate in activities, and even return home to her family. It appeared to be a miracle cure for one of psychiatry's most challenging conditions. Encouraged by this success, Moniz and Lima performed the procedure on 19 more patients over the next few months. The results were mixed but intriguing. Some patients showed remarkable improvements, their crippling anxiety and depression lifting like fog clearing from a mountain peak. Others showed little change, and a few became worse. But for the first time in the history of psychiatry, doctors had a treatment that could dramatically and immediately alter the course of severe mental illness. Moniz carefully documented his results and published them in medical journals. The response from the international medical community was intense and divided. Some doctors were fascinated by the possibility of a surgical cure for mental illness. Others were appalled by the idea of deliberately damaging the brain. The debate raged in medical conferences and journals, with passionate arguments on both sides. Word of Moniz's work spread quickly across the Atlantic. In 1936, just 1 year after the first procedure, two American doctors, Walter Freeman and James Watts, performed the first lobotomy in the United States. Freeman was a neurologist who had spent his career searching for effective treatments for mental illness. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly convinced that lobotomy could revolutionize psychiatry. Freeman had visited European hospitals and seen the desperate conditions firsthand. He had watched patients deteriorate year after year in overcrowded wards, their families giving up hope, their doctors admitting defeat. The possibility of a surgical solution captivated him. If lobotomy could free even a fraction of these patients from their mental prisons, it would be worth pursuing. Freeman and Watts refined the technique, developing what they called the prefrontal lobotomy. They were more careful than Moniz, studying their patients extensively before and after surgery, documenting the changes in personality and behavior with psychological tests and detailed observations. Their early results were encouraging enough that other doctors began to take notice. The first American patient was a 63-year-old former schoolteacher named Alice Hemmett, who had been hospitalized for severe depression and agitation. After the procedure, she became calm and was able to return home to her family. Freeman and Watts published their results, and by 1940, lobotomies were being performed in hospitals across America. But it was what happened next that would make lobotomy one of the most controversial medical procedures in history. Freeman became convinced that the standard lobotomy was too complicated and time-consuming. The procedure required a neurosurgeon, an operating room, and general anesthesia. Most hospitals, especially state institutions, didn't have access to these resources. Freeman believed that mental illness was so widespread and devastating that doctors needed a simpler, faster way to perform the operation. Freeman's solution was revolutionary and terrifying. In 1945, he developed what he called the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure that could be performed in a doctor's office without general anesthesia. The patient would be sedated with electroshock therapy. Then Freeman would use an instrument that looked remarkably like an ice pick to access the brain through the eye socket. The procedure was deceptively simple. Freeman would lift the patient's eyelid and insert the leukotomy above the eyeball, sliding it through the thin bone at the top of the eye socket and into the brain. With a few quick movements, he could sever the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes, and patients could walk out of the office the same day. Freeman began traveling across the country in what he called his lobotomobile, a converted van equipped with everything needed to perform the procedure. He would arrive at state hospitals and perform dozens of lobotomies in a single day, moving from patient to patient with assembly line efficiency. To him, it was a medical miracle. He was bringing relief to thousands of patients who had been written off as hopeless. He was emptying overcrowded wards and reuniting families with loved ones who had been lost to mental illness. The statistics seemed to support Freeman's enthusiasm. By the 1950s, thousands of lobotomies were being performed each year in the United States. Freeman personally performed over 3,500 procedures during his career. Many patients did show improvement. Their anxiety and depression lifted, their violent or self-destructive behaviors stopped, and they were able to leave the hospital and return to their families. For the first time in decades, state hospitals were able to discharge significant numbers of patients. Hospital administrators loved the procedure because it solved their overcrowding problems, and families were grateful to have their loved ones back home. Even many patients expressed satisfaction with the results, saying they felt calmer and happier than they had in years. Freeman was hailed as a hero, the doctor who had found a cure for mental illness. But there was a dark side to this medical revolution that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. While lobotomy could eliminate symptoms like anxiety and depression, it also had profound effects on personality and cognitive function. Many patients emerged from the procedure as shadows of their former selves. They lost their ability to feel deep emotions, their creativity, their drive and ambition. They became docile and compliant, but they also became somehow less human. The changes were subtle at first, noticed mainly by family members who knew the patients well. A once passionate artist would lose all interest in painting. A formerly ambitious businessman would become content to sit in a chair all day. A loving mother would care for her children, but with a mechanical detachment that left them feeling orphaned despite her presence. The most famous case that exposed these problems was that of Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of future President John F. Kennedy. Rosemary had been born with mild intellectual disabilities and had always been a challenge for her ambitious family. As she grew older, she became increasingly difficult to manage, prone to violent outbursts and erratic behavior that embarrassed the politically minded Kennedys. In 1941, when Rosemary was 23, her father Joseph Kennedy secretly arranged for her to receive a lobotomy. The procedure was performed by Freeman and Watts, who had assured Kennedy that his daughter would be cured of her behavioral problems. The operation was a disaster. Rosemary, who had been able to read and write before the procedure, was left with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She lost the ability to walk or talk coherently and spent the rest of her life in an institution. The Kennedy family kept her conditions secret for decades, telling people that Rosemary was living quietly in the country. It wasn't until the 1980s that the truth about her lobotomy became public. Her story became a powerful symbol of the dangers of the procedure and the importance of informed consent in medical treatment. Stories like Rosemary's began to accumulate throughout the 1950s. Families who had been told their loved ones would be cured instead found themselves caring for people who were alive, but somehow no longer themselves. The medical community began to question whether the benefits of lobotomy outweighed its costs. Critics argued that the procedure was being performed too casually on patients who might have been helped by other treatments. The controversy deepened when investigative reporters began looking into the conditions under which many lobotomies were performed. They found that the procedure was often used as a form of social control, performed on patients who were inconvenient or disruptive rather than genuinely ill. Women were lobotomized for being too sexual or too independent. Children were lobotomized for being difficult in school. Homosexuals were lobotomized in attempts to cure their sexuality. The procedure that had been developed to treat severe mental illness was being used to enforce social conformity. Hospital administrators found it easier to lobotomize difficult patients than to provide proper care and treatment. The operation became a tool of oppression, used to silence dissent and eliminate inconvenient personalities. As the 1950s progressed, the medical tide began to turn against lobotomy in the development of new psychiatric medications, particularly chlorpromazine in 1952, provided doctors with alternatives that could calm disturbed patients without permanently altering their brains. These drugs weren't perfect, and they had side effects, but they were reversible and didn't destroy the patient's personality. More importantly, the medical community began to develop a more sophisticated understanding of mental illness and medical ethics. The Nuremberg trials had exposed the horrors of medical experimentation without consent, and doctors began to question whether they had the right to permanently alter a patient's brain without being absolutely certain that the benefits outweighed the risks. The development of psychotherapy also provided alternatives to surgical intervention. Techniques like psychoanalysis, cognitive therapy, and group therapy offered hope for patients who might have been lobotomized in earlier decades. These treatments took longer and required more skilled practitioners, but they preserved the patient's personality and dignity. By the 1960s, lobotomy had largely fallen out of favor in most developed countries. The procedure that had once been hailed as a medical miracle was now seen as a symbol of medical overreach and the dangers of treating complex problems with simple solutions. Antonio Egas Moniz, who had won the Nobel Prize for developing the procedure, began to be viewed more critically as the long-term effects of lobotomy became clear. The final blow to lobotomy's reputation came with the development of modern neuroscience and brain imaging. As doctors gained a better understanding of how the brain worked, they realized that the frontal lobe was far more important than previously thought. It wasn't just involved in emotion and personality. It was crucial for executive function, decision-making, and complex thinking. Destroying connections in this area was like removing the conductor from an orchestra, leaving the patient's mental processes chaotic and diminished. The story of lobotomy serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of medical ethics and the need for careful, long-term study of new treatments. It shows how desperation can lead well-intentioned doctors to make decisions that seem reasonable at the time, but have devastating consequences. It also illustrates the danger of treating complex problems like mental illness with overly simple solutions. But perhaps most importantly, the lobotomy story shows us how far we've come in our understanding of mental illness and our commitment to treating patients with dignity and respect. Today, we have sophisticated medications that can effectively treat many mental conditions without permanently altering the brain. We have psychotherapy techniques that can help patients understand and manage their conditions. We have support systems that allow people with mental illness to live full, productive lives in their communities. The patients who underwent lobotomy in the mid-20th century were pioneers in a sense, though they never chose to be. Their suffering and sacrifice led to important advances in medical ethics and helped establish the principles of informed consent that protect patients today. Their stories remind us that medical progress is not always linear and that every new treatment must be carefully evaluated, not just for its immediate effects, but for its long-term consequences. The legacy of lobotomy also reminds us that mental illness is not a moral failing or a sign of weakness. It's a medical condition that deserves the same careful, compassionate treatment as any other illness. The patients who were lobotomized were not criminals or moral failures. They were people suffering from conditions that medicine didn't yet understand how to treat effectively. Today, when we look back at the lobotomy era, it's easy to feel superior to those doctors who performed procedures that now seem barbaric. But it's important to remember that they were working with the knowledge and tools available to them at the time. They were trying to help patients who were suffering terribly, and for whom few other options existed. The tragedy is not that they tried to help, but that they moved too quickly from experimental procedures to widespread practice without adequate safeguards. The story of lobotomy teaches us that medical progress requires not just scientific innovation, but also wisdom, patience, and a deep respect for the complexity of human beings. It reminds us that the brain is not just another organ, but the seat of everything that makes us who we are. Any treatment that alters the brain must be approached with extraordinary caution and respect for the person whose mind hangs in the balance. As we continue to develop new treatments for mental illness, from deep brain stimulation to genetic therapies, the lessons of the lobotomy era remain relevant. We must remember that behind every patient is a person with hopes, dreams, fears, and relationships. We must ensure that our treatments preserve not just life, but the essence of what makes each person unique and human. The patients who underwent lobotomy paid a terrible price for medical progress, but their sacrifice was not in vain if we learn from their stories and use those lessons to build a more humane and effective system of mental health care. Their legacy challenges us to do better, to be more careful, and to never forget that the ultimate goal of medicine is not just to treat illness, but to preserve and enhance the full richness of human experience. In the end, the story of lobotomy is a story about the human condition itself, about our capacity for both tremendous compassion and terrible mistakes, about our endless quest to understand and heal the most mysterious organ in our bodies. It's a reminder that medical progress is not just about developing new technologies, but about growing in wisdom and humility as we try to help our fellow human beings in their darkest moments. The journey from the medieval dungeons to modern psychiatric care has been long and often tragic, but each step has brought us closer to truly understanding and effectively treating the magnificent complexity of the human mind.